Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about actually how to grease your excavator, skid steer, or any piece of equipment that you have. I made a whole video on what type of grease to use. Didn't really occur to me to make a video on how to actually grease the equipment, but someone asked in the comments if I could make a video on actually how to grease the equipment. And it occurred to me that, you know, not everybody has ever owned a piece of equipment like this before, and they may not be familiar with all the ins and outs of greasing. It's not complicated, but still, it's something that if you've never done it before, you might not know everything about greasing. And I see a lot of comments in the Facebook groups asking questions about the different types of zerks and what to do about this or that. So today I thought, what the heck, I'm gonna make a video on greasing these machines, showing you how to do it, why you're doing it, etc., and cover all the bases so that hopefully when you leave this video, you'll know everything you need to know about how to grease your equipment. So what do I need to buy to grease all my equipment? Well, obviously right off the bat, you're gonna need grease. So as I covered in the other video, any lithium complex grease, EP grease, lithium complex, will work. I'm choosing to use 3% moly grease on all of my pins and bushings, but it's not the grease I'm going to use for everything on this machine, and I'll cover that in a moment. You're going to need a grease gun. I bought an electric one. You don't have to have an electric one. They sometimes send that little tiny one when you get your Chinese equipment in the little toolbox. You could use it, it's fine. You could buy the smaller tubes, but these things do take quite a bit of grease, and you go through grease pretty fast. So a manual grease gun, an electric one like this, either one's fine. On this one, I chose to put the tip that has the quick connect on it that will latch on, so you don't have to, sometimes when you push the old grease tip on, it pops off. So this is handy to have. Paper towels. You're gonna want a lot of paper towels because grease gets everywhere. Gloves too. I always wear gloves when I grease, have a lot of paper towels around because it seems like, I swear, I try to be so careful, I still get grease all over myself. I don't know how, it just, grease is what it is. So probably wearing too nice of clothes today to do this, but I'm not actually gonna grease everything today, but for demonstration purposes, I think I'm fine, but wear old clothes, wear gloves, you're gonna make a mess. And then I usually like to have a screwdriver too for cleaning around the zerks, and I'll show you about that in just a moment. The other thing I have is this kit I bought on Amazon, and it basically contains all the different fittings for the different types of zerks, and I'll show you where you can use these needle zerks and ones that can go, if in an inaccessible place, instead of having to go straight in on the zerk, you can go down on it at a 90-degree angle. And these come in handy in tight places on certain machines, so it's kind of nice to have if you have that kind of machine. Okay, so let's start right off the bat. Why are we greasing these machines? Well, these joints right here that have a pin through them, there's usually a bushing in there, and this is the wear point on your machine. I know obviously this is pretty common sense, but you want to reduce the friction between the pin here and the end of this piston here or this cylinder. So that's going to be moving up and down. So obviously number one is to reduce friction. But the number two reason is you want to not let water and debris migrate into this joint and between the pin and the bushing, because that just accelerates wear on this joint. One of the reasons you need to grease your machine is obviously you want to reduce friction, but water can get in here and dirt can get in here. And what you don't want is for this pin to start binding with the bearings inside this unit, because these are powerful hydraulics. And if you get any kind of binding in here, what it will do is it will grab. I mean, it's going to move this joint, and you want it to slide freely, because if it doesn't, you might start to see, you know, these welds here. These are nice pins because they are actually captured by this welded piece here. But you could imagine if this pin were to freeze, something's going to give and move. It might break this weld off in this piece here. So on your machines, if you're looking at your grease joints, you're going to want to make sure that if it's welded around the joint like this is, that these aren't cracked or anything. If it's an older machine, especially the older Kubotas and bigger machines like that, those have big welded areas, and you've seen those can crack out because they're so powerful that if the joint and the pin here grabs because it's frozen, something's going to break on the machine. And that's what we're really trying to avoid here, premature wear on these pins and these joints. So greasing often, and can't over grease it, so just do it a lot. If it seems dirty, grease it. Watch for that grease to come out, and you know that you've done a good job. So this is an open grease joint. So what that means is that when you have a zerk here at the end, and this is just a regular old grease zerk, standard. There's really two types of grease zerks you're going to find on these machines. One is the standard grease zerk here, and the other is what they call a needle zerk. And that looks like that. Now, a lot of people don't like these, and they'll take them off and replace them with a regular old standard grease zerk. I don't really mind them. If they bother you, take them off. Sometimes they're put on machines in places where the one that sticks out could get broken off. So the needle zerk kind of sticks there and stays low profile so it can't break off. But again, if you want to replace them, they're easy enough to replace. You can buy a kit at Harbor Freight. They just unscrew and you can replace them. Now these in here are recessed actually into the pins, so that provides them with that protection so they can't get broken off. And that's a great way to keep those protected, is to have them recessed like that. But not all of them are recessed, so if they're in a vulnerable place, sometimes that's where the needle zerk comes in. So how many grease zerks are on these machines? Well, it's a good question. A lot. On this particular machine, there's grease zerks. There's two here on this particular point. There's one on each pin here. There's one here, one here, one here, one here. Basically any pivot points, wear points, there's going to be a grease zerk for you to grease. There's ones here and there's one here on these arms. And there they are in there. So know where the grease zerks are. What really helps is if you have an owner's manual for your machine, because they'll tell you where the grease zerks are on the machine. If you don't have an owner's manual, it may be a little hard because sometimes they're hidden. I can tell you that on my Cardiwell, underneath the panel under the seat and on the floor there were some grease zerks that you really had to kind of look for. Now in excavators, you're usually going to have two grease zerks right here. And what those are is one is going to be for your gear and swing motor gear where they mesh, and the other one's going to be for your slew bearing. And we're going to cover the difference between those two in just a little bit, but you don't really know which is which. That's why a manual really comes in handy. I know because my Jansen MB500 came with a manual that explains where which grease zerk goes to which of those grease points. But if you have an excavator with no manual and you have two, the best advice I can give you is to take the floorboard off and follow those tubes. And you'll see that one will lead to your swing motor and one will be on the other side of it, somewhere inside, and that's going straight down into your slew bearing gear. So before we move on to actually greasing the machine, I just took a pin off the machine. I want to show you what kind of what it looks like when you're greasing. So there's your grease zerk. And as you can see, inside that grease zerk, it looks kind of dark. That's where you're going to want to really take a screwdriver and go in here and clean this out. You don't have to do it every time. You definitely want to take a paper towel though and wipe off the end of that grease zerk, because you don't want to force dirt actually into the joint you're about to grease. Now, this is probably a typical pin, but you can see there's spirals cut into it. And there's also a hole. Well, that grease comes through the zerk here. It comes out of this grease hole here, and then it is able to migrate down these spirals to get to both sides of the joint. So sometimes the bearing will have these grooves carved into it to allow the grease to migrate through to both sides of the joint. So when you're greasing, you're going to want to make sure, and I'm going to demonstrate this, that when you put your grease gun here on this zerk and grease, you're going to want to make sure you see grease coming out on both sides of the joint. So before you grease, a joint, you're going to take your paper towel and you're going to wipe off the end of the grease zerk to make sure that there's no dirt getting inside. You're also going to want to clean off the end of your gun itself to make sure that it doesn't have any dirt on the outside of it. At this point, you can attach your gun and then go ahead and, now there, grease just started coming out of that joint. So that's when I know I've put enough in. So that fresh layer of grease is going to prevent dirt and water and anything else from migrating in there while I'm working on the job site. So you might ask yourself, how often do I grease these machines? Well, it kind of depends. You can be in a habit where every time you take it out, you can grease it. You can't really over-grease open grease joints. We're going to talk about sealed grease joints in a minute, but for the open grease joints that I showed you that I just greased, you can grease them daily, and if that's your routine, you're doing nothing wrong and you're not going to hurt it. You might be using more grease than you need to, but that's okay. Grease is relatively inexpensive compared to the machine. However, for a homeowner who's using the machine a little bit, maybe doing light work, maybe not even getting it really that dirty, then you're going to want to do it maybe every 10 hours. Would be a time to do it. Just make sure you do it on a regular interval and you're monitoring your joints, making sure if you see that they're dirty, go ahead and clean them, put some grease in there, and know you have a fresh layer of grease going in. Okay, now let's talk about on your excavator, those two special grease fittings you have down here at the front of your machine. One is for the slew bearing and one is for the teeth of the swing motor, where it meshes with the ring gear for the house. So how often do we grease those? Well, I know because I have a manual. And what the manual says is that for the greasing of the swing ball bearings every 100 hours, and for the greasing of the swing bearing teeth every 50 hours. So you're going to want to make sure that when you got your machine, it had grease in it. If you've got your machine and you found that there wasn't any grease in any of these other joints, then it's probably not going to be in your swing gear and your slew bearing. How do you check that? Well, if you want to be safe, the best way to do that is to take the floor off, pull the tube, and put grease on the one end and see if it comes out of the other end or if the tube was dry. Then you'll know there was no grease in there and you need to do the initial greasing on that. It's very critical to do that. So here's the thing about the slew bearing. The slew bearing is a special case. What is a slew bearing? Well, it is actually ball bearings, and they're sealed and they're underneath the house, and that's what the house swings on. Okay, so let's talk about that slew bearing for a minute. So I know from here in my manual, because it's an exploded, if you don't know what the slew bearing is, here's the gear that goes down that swings the house. Well, that sits on top of this housing right here. And there's going to be a series of ball bearings in here that are going to swing this house around. And that's going to be providing the bearing point for this house to swing around 360 degrees. So here are my two remote grease points for this machine. So a remote grease point is one where it's attached to a tube that feeds the intended bearing surface. On some of the large excavators, where the arm, the boom here goes up really, really high, you might have, I've seen them where they have a block on here and there might be 5 or 6 remote grease zerks with metal tubing that feeds them to their respective bearing surfaces. So that's why they have those, because they're hard to get to. And it's the same thing with this. They put these on tubes because otherwise you have to take this whole top panel off to get to where you need that grease to go, because it's in an inaccessible place. So I know for a fact, because of my book, my owner's manual, that this one here leads to the swing motor gear that swings the house around. This one is for the slew bearing. You do not want to over-grease your slew bearing. So let's talk about that special case of bearings, and that is the sealed bearing. So I told you earlier that we didn't want to use the moly grease for everything on the excavator. So the slew bearing is the one exception where you do not want to use moly grease. If you use it, I wouldn't freak out, you're probably fine. But it can build up over time, and that's not really what you want in your slew bearing, because they add actual particles into the moly grease to prevent friction between the pins and joints in case the grease gets squeezed out. Well, the slew bearing is sealed in there, and the grease, generally speaking, doesn't get squeezed out. So two things about that slew bearing. One, you do not want to over grease it. Follow your owner's manuals for their instructions. If you have a machine without instructions, then you're going to have to guess. I would probably go ahead and do it one time. Don't over grease, maybe 5 shots. And you spin the house a quarter turn, grease, spin it a quarter turn, grease, etc., to get grease evenly distributed amongst that bearing. But I will tell you, you don't want to do that every time you grease the rest of the machine. Maybe every 100 hours, like it says in my manual, you'd want to do that, because you don't want to over grease that, because there's nowhere for that grease really to go, and you can actually bind up those little ball bearings and then prevent them from what they need to do. So for your teeth and your ring gear, my book recommends every 50 hours, so it's something that you don't have to do daily. But if you're getting a lot of dirt up under your machine, take a look at it. You can visually see that grease, that swing motor bearing gear underneath your machine. Take a look at it. If there's no grease or it looks dirty, grease it. You're not going to hurt it. That's an open grease point. So the next type of joint I want to talk to you about is a sealed grease joint. Now, I do have a sealed grease point right here. So there's a needle zerk here, but it's a sealed bearing. It's a dust cap in there, and I have seen people from the forums talking about the Durette, that the Durette manual says to put grease in here until you see it coming out. Well, unfortunately, people have followed that advice and they've blown this seal out here at the front. So if you have a sealed bearing like that, and you're really kind of confused how much grease to put in, all I can tell you is what I do is I'm squirting about every 10 hours, I put 5 pumps in. And the important thing is there's grease going in, it's not coming out, it's not an open system, and I'm applying, it is getting grease, and just not going to overdo it and blow out that seal. So use your best judgment on that, but you really don't want to pop that seal on that particular bearing, so just be judicious in how much grease you use. So if you want to grease a needle zerk, I just have an adapter here that came in that kit that I put in the end of my quick attach, and then that needle there will go into the needle zerk and grease it. So you just put your needle zerk into that. And I gave it 5 squirts, which I do about every 10 hours or so. So we pretty much covered the grease joints on a typical excavator. They're going to be your open grease joints such as this. They're going to have the zerks where you see them here. There's going to be some like here on the swing pedal that, there's a grease zerk right here, a little bit hidden, so you want to keep an eye. Anything that moves or has a movement to it. I know that all of these handles here feed through a central lever. You can't really see them, but there are 2 grease zerks in here. I have to remove this panel, and then I can grease up this. It's not going to be something you're going to have to do very often, because that's not a point that's getting grease and, water and dirt there on a regular basis. So just every once in a blue moon, you're going to want to shoot some grease in there to keep that lubricated. The bearings here on my drive sprockets, they do not have grease joints. Those are sealed bearings. So those are greased at the factory. And I know that some people drill these out and add grease zerks to them, and that's fine. If you're handy and you want to do that, that would be something you could consider doing. But for the most part, those are sealed bearings, and you're not going to mess with them when they wear out. Replace them with the bearings. Now, on my Durette, everything I told you about the excavator is the same thing. It has the exact same type of grease zerks. You're going to grease those until you see grease squeeze out here. Sometimes on your excavators or your skid steers, if you're getting them from China and the joints are kind of sloppy, like on this, these are pretty tight. There is really no slop in these joints here. But on my Cardywell, there is a lot of movement and play between the piston rod and the sides here. So you can add actual shims in here. And what that will do for you, you don't want them to be tight, but you want this to not have like a ton of play. And those shims will actually help create that seal that prevents dirt and water from penetrating that joint there. But on my Durette and this machine, quite frankly, the joints are pretty tight. I don't really have to worry about shims right now for these machines. So that covers the basics on greasing your machines. If I left anything out, please put it in the comments. If you enjoy the content on this channel, please like and subscribe. If you have an idea for a video like this one, please put it in the comments also. I'm always happy to make a video. Like I said, I didn't even think of making a video on how to grease machines until someone asked, and then I realized, you know what, not all of us have equipment and have ever done this before, and maybe you're getting your first piece of equipment in and there's things you want to know about it. So be sure to ask so we can get those videos made. So until next time, this is Jeff with the Excavator channel, and are you digging or are you filling?